Arundhathi Subramaniam is the author of 13 books of poetry and prose, shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2015. She is the recipient of the Sahitya Academy Award, the inaugural Khushwant Singh Prize, the Raza Award for Poetry, the Il Chapo Award in Italy, the Mystic Hilinga Award, the Z Women's Award for Literature, and the Homi Papa and Charles Wallace Fellowships. Arundhati is joined in conversation by Akhil Katyal.
Hi, Arundhati.
Hi,
am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Perfect. So, Arundhati, the two of us are moderately outnumbered by the audience members here. So we can have a small, intimate conversation.
Yes.
Actually, and Arundhati and I have been in touch over the last week, and I've had the pleasure of reading her book, Love Without a Story, on which we focus the conversation, and Arundhati has also kindly engaged with a manuscript that I've been working on. And I thought maybe I'll begin with telling all of you a little bit about Love Without a Story, which is a book by Arundhati which came out in 2019. It's quite remarkable how when you do not let the idea of love be held hostage only to the idea of the romantic couple, and when you extricate it from that narrative, when you extricate it from that story, of a predictable story of sorts, when you take it out, you open up so many worlds. And one of the greatest pleasures of reading Love Without a Story was precisely that you got worlds of friendship, worlds which were committed to a spiritual practice, worlds of sisterhood, a common womanhood that she shared as a poet, and a kind of cosmopolitan kinship which actually across the bones in the collection you notice along with your travels. And this way, although it's a commonplace idea, word, concept where each of us have a claim to it and an understanding of it, she defamiliarizes love for us, which is a very hard thing to do. And one of the ways, in fact, and maybe we can start with that question, Arundhati. One of the ways in which she does that is actually she allows no secondariness to the idea of friendship. Like usually modern ideas of romance, they rely on the peripheral nature of friendship. They rely on the fact that friendship will at some point be outsmarted by and outlived by love. And yet, throughout the collection, there is constantly a resonance of what the figure of friend means and how precious the expenditure of time with friends can be. So Arundhati, maybe we could start this conversation just by thinking about what the division of labor is between love and friendship in a volume such as yours, and proceed from there. And maybe you could read a poem as well to illustrate what you wish to say.
But I want to start by thanking you, Akhil, and thanking you for your close reading of the text, and also letting you know that your manuscript is one that I've enjoyed a great deal. And one of the reasons I'm so looking forward to today is because what I was struck by were the convergences between our texts. Their treatment is very different, but they return to this idea of, I think, central ideas of love, loss, and perhaps most fundamentally, which I, a state that I think is central to love, bewilderment. And I think in many ways that is really what churns at the heart of both our texts in different ways. I'm particularly pleased that you bring up the question of friendship, because for me at the very start, and this is something I've said again and again, Akhil, as far as whenever I've talked about this book, the immediate assumption for people is when you use the word love, that it can only mean romantic love. And this is, of course, despite the fact that we've had a wonderful world heritage of sacred poetry that speaks of love. We've had paeans to friendship as well that are very much part of our inheritance. And yet somehow we make this assumption. And that was something I didn't want to do in this book. And it wasn't conscious. I often say that the thing about love stories, and here, of course, I mean romantic love stories. The thing about romantic love stories is that they come to an end at some point or the other. They're intrinsically, by definition, unstable. Wonderful, exhilarating, unstable. Whereas in some way, and I'm not the first obviously to have said this, we can go back to, Plato, we can go back to the Buddhist idea of noble friendships, we can go back to the Sufi idea of what the teacher can mean in your life and so on. But the idea of friendship as a far more stable, far more equanimous relationship is one that has always made great sense to me. So I think when love stories end, it is possible for stories to subside and for love of a kind to remain. Not the love of peaks and troughs and crests and none of that, none of the highs and lows of the human cardiogram, but just the sense of a gaze that includes more than it leaves out. A gaze that is affectionate, but not sticky, not clingy, not needy. To me, that's the kind of love I wanted to talk about in this book. And it appeared time and again, which is when the title began to suggest itself, because it's a phrase in one of the poems, as you might recall. There's a poem called The Fine Art of Aging, in which the phrase emerges, love without a story. And it struck me as apposite because this is a book that talks of different kinds of love, the love of parents, the love of friends, the love of unexpected moments of friendship with unexpected people that one might meet on one's journeys. It could be a person whose faith and whose politics are at great variance with one's own, whose life choices are at great variance with one's own. And yet there are moments of kinship that it talks about, whether it's with a woman in Laverna or a Pakistani poet in Ajmer, the moments of kinship. And then, of course, there are friends and parents and lovers. And there is also, I think, very deep in the book and perhaps central to the book, the idea of the sacred quester, Abayar, who is an old woman, a seeker, a traveler, a poet, and a major figure in Tamil cultural consciousness. There is no Tamilian who doesn't know Abayar. So perhaps it was inevitable that she would creep into my poetry at some point. But what interests me in Abayar, Akhil, is the fact that when she has this celebrated meeting with this little boy who turns out to be God, he's the son of Shiva himself, Muruga. She has the celebrated meeting with him, and yet what fascinates me, and perhaps this is why the story matters to me, what fascinates me about that meeting is their gaze is level. They meet as equals. The human and the divine come together in this moment as equals. And this to me is also our legacy, and the legacy of sacred poetry in this country, that invites us time and again to this view of the sacred, of the divine, as the friend. Appar, who is a major poet, Tamil poet, has a poem in which he speaks of just that. He says, why wake up every morning at the crack of dawn and bathe? Why perform every ritual according to the rules? All this is in vain if you cannot say, he is my friend. And that's how Abayar and Muruga greet each other. The human and the divine looking each other in the eye in an egalitarian relationship. Female and male coming together in an egalitarian relationship. Old age and youth coming together in a relationship of absolute equality. And innocence and experience looking each other in the eye in absolute equality. That to me is what that poem is about. So maybe I will read a little from that poem, but before I come to Abayar, I'm also tempted to read an important poem to a contemporary friendship. And it's called Deleting the Picture. We can come to Abayar a little later. Let me read Deleting the Picture to you, which is a poem I actually wanted to read for you after having read your manuscript. So, Deleting the Picture for AA 1967 to 2015, which squarely implicates the notion of friendship. It's 2005, and we're almost glamorous, the five of us. The chairs are cane, my shirt batik, the sunshine Goa, and Heineken. We're past the clumsy brutality of 18. We've deleted makeshift faces, borrowed persuasions, stances without journeys. We've forgiven the treacheries of student seminars, wrong addresses at different ends of the city, digressions of faith. No edge to our voices anymore when we say Zen or Gramsci. We're wearing the dumb happy of holiday and wearing it well. And there's always so much sun. Against lime-washed churches and casual plantations of melted green, we're laughing hard, beer-glazed, sand-drizzled, stoned on Sergeant Pepper and Kishore Kumar. And there's the other picture. Look, where arms entwined, we are bathed in fierce siesta light. And we seem to know that this moment is teetering on the verge of never again. It isn't difficult, of course, to skip the nostalgia, to fast forward the embarrassment of memory, to speak, as others do, of calcium rather than satori. So the morning I heard it wasn't difficult to turn efficient, to delete pictures of hummingbirds and cardamom tea and the air ticket you emailed me, never knowing it would be the one to your funeral. It gets easier, friend, with age, to delete, to plan breakfast, to turn the page. It would have been easier still if you hadn't deleted the sun. And with that, Akhil, I want to actually, before we move into Abhayar or any of the other poems, I actually want to connect at this point with your manuscript, if I may. Yeah, and I want to ask you about something that I find to be, and I think perhaps every poet, a constant challenge when one is dealing with a single or dominant emotional state. In your case, grief. And one of the things that struck me, perhaps what struck me the most about your book, was the way in which it combines a kind of open-throated vulnerability and combines that with this very quiet craft. The craft is very much there, it's unobtrusive and very present. And this combination interests me. And I think my central question to you, which I'm going to keep returning to, is really, how does one retain that kind of hoarseness of voice, that hoarseness and muteness and coming back to that word, the bewilderment of pain? How does one retain that without resorting to all the things human beings customarily resort to, which is rage or recrimination or rationalization, not resorting to any of that, staying true to the grief of that moment? Was that a challenge? And would you tell us more about that?
Thanks a lot, Arundhathi. Actually, as you know, that's a central question that is sort of stays with one throughout the manuscript. But before I come to that, what I find remarkable about deleting the picture and in several other poems of Arundhathi in the collection is just this. It's remarkable what you were saying about that moment of horizontality, which in one sense, love, which seems to be like a botched experiment in symmetry, just does not allow. And whereas friendship, this egalitarian horizontal gaze, is capable in these moments of friendship. And we were, in the conversation that we were having in this week, we were also thinking of that beautiful Wisława Szymborska poem, A Thank You Note, in which she's actually thanking her friends to keep her in a three-dimensional space and outside the kind of rhetorical and lyrical excesses of love. And that's what I think, this matter-of-factness, this forthrightness of the gaze between the figures that you describe and even in deleting the picture is precisely because you open the world of friendship. Thank you so much for articulating the struggle that is at the core of this manuscript which Arundhathi and I exchanged, and it's called A Biography of After, and I've been working on it over the last three and a half years, and it registers a moment of loss and tells the story of how does the after get shaped. And there are clearly different stages to it, though they are not in any easy sequence with each other. And as you rightly said, that the struggle is how do you remain true to the hoarseness and the intensity of that feeling while neither making it self-indulgent or navel-gazing, or while letting it exclude a host of experiences which we are also making sense of as we are experiencing grief. And I think, one of the poems that, and I'm sure you think about this poem as well, one of the poems that I often go back to is that W.H. Auden poem about, the Musée des Beaux-Arts, which is about the fall of Icarus in that Bruegel painting. And he says this remarkable thing about suffering, that it happens in a corner while the world sort of carries on. And he refers to this kind of Peter Bruegel, the painter from Brussels, where it's about the fall of Icarus, the one who became too proud and strove towards the sun and then fell. And he fell, and it's a distant, small, little corner event happening in the painting, whereas the farmers are doing their farming, the ships are doing their sailing, the people are going upon their daily business. And I think one of the ways to remain true to that grief, Arundhati, was precisely that you register the weight that it has for you, while in the larger scheme of things, you also realize its minusculeness. You attempt a register which is capable, which at least hopes to simultaneously take stock of these two things. One of the things which helped me is, when you say that craft coexists with a kind of a cry of sorts, what helps me is a toolbox of poetry which I guess helps all of us, which is, there's this with that which allows us to manipulate sense, sound, space in a poem, and which gives you some kind of affective distance with that grief, where you are where the poem is no longer simply a kind of a guttural cry, but it becomes like a vessel for what you hope to say, a vessel for what you believe. And I think that toolbox of poetry allows it to become that vessel. One of the things I find remarkable in your work as well, all the time when I was reading Arundhathi's work, I was like underlining it throughout, precisely because these images stood out to me. And I think the image does it for us. The image is this.
In fact, before I even ask you, I want to come back, Akhil, if I may interject. I want you to talk about form, but I also want you very specifically to read a couple of poems, if you will, because what interested me in these two poems in particular, they're short, and I think there's time for us to, I hope we're going to have time to read some poems in this conversation. I really wanted to ask you to read them because for me it seemed like the very reverse of the journey that we customarily speak of. When we speak of falling in love, or we speak of poetry, we're talking about making the mundane magical. But in these two poems, what you're talking about is the state of after the relationship, when in fact the magical becomes mundane. So you're talking about desacramentalized relationships, in a sense. And I'd love you to read this particular poem. I think it's called The Room Has Become Ordinary Again. This room has become ordinary again. Also, there's something wrong with my doorbell.
So in fact, so I'll read those poems, and as Arundhati already mentioned, the central device there is the image, which is able to concretize otherwise what could have been a very amorphous feeling. And this, I'll just read the poems and then maybe we can think about that. The first poem is called There's Something Wrong with My Doorbell. There's something wrong with my doorbell. Whenever it rains, it starts ringing on its own. Once at midnight, after I'd slept, the plastic bird song filled my apartment and I woke up to no one. The next morning, the electrician told me that water seeps into the wiring, setting off conduction. I nodded and paid for the repair. The rain was at my door, and I did not answer. And the second poem is the one where Arundhathi very evocatively called it the desacramentalization of the everyday. The poem is called "The Room Became Ordinary Again." The room became ordinary again the night you left. It returned to its straight-backed walls and its small doors. The floor somehow was stone again, and the one window that looked out turned into the grain of waiting. As the sacrament of your voice slowly left the doorstep, everything that had been briefly mystified by a strange hand returned to this world. When I came back to my room, knowing it no longer housed miracles, that you were no longer mine, I could feel the body of everything turn into bread, the blood of every hour turn into wine. And I think Arundhathi is precisely, instead of saying, for instance, that there were a host of possibilities which have now been confounded. One says the rain was at my door and I did not answer. Or instead of saying that the world is banal again, one says that the body of everything is turned into bread and the blood of every hour is turned into wine. And I think that manipulation of sense which the image allows us to do is one of the ways to create some form of distance from that gutturalness, while it becomes a kind of a container precisely for that hoarseness which grief throws us into, which then it, as Love Without a Story also attempts to do, then finds vocabulary for it. In fact, one of the things that both you and I think about constantly is, when we think about love poetry, there is, obviously sometimes there is this kind of narrowness of the insular eye, the one which can be self-indulgent, the one which can be navel-gazing. And there is a way in which the eye in Love Without a Story actually has great expanse to it. And it creates different kinds of communities inside it. It could be of friends, it could be with the sacred, it could be with a kind of sisterhood, it could be through this kind of cosmopolitan kinship which you, as you already spoke of in a few examples. So, if you could maybe think aloud about what is the relationship between this I and we in Love Without a Story, and what allows you to toggle between these, and maybe a poem which could also help us think about, at one end of it is a kind of the ego which has just lost something, and at the other end of it is this kind of shared predicament of humanity as such. And there are several stages in between. What does the love poet do to avoid any form of insularity?
It's a good question, Akhil. I think I agonized a lot about this, the possible insularity and the solipsism of the I, much more in my earlier poetry. In my first book, for instance, I remember what a big deal it was personally, not for the world, personally, to write a poem called 546 Andheri Local. Just to be able to say, I'm going to implicate this particular suburb in Bombay and believe that it will find its way to be decoded, it will be understood by some unwary reader who stumbles upon it somewhere in the world. To keep the faith. And I always marveled at the fact, of course, that you and I were expected to understand the 450 from Paddington, and that we knew, of course, every place on that Monopoly board, and never really had a problem when we navigated our way through London, simply because we knew all the names before we got there. But this was really, for me, an important moment to be able to say, my local space that I'm going to implicate and expect you to understand. And it was done with a certain hesitancy, but also with a personal sense of, this is my act of impunity, as it were. I think with the later poetry, I decided to agonize less. And there were probably many reasons for that. One is, of course, somewhere that essential feminist insight about the personal being the political was something that had percolated more deeply. And I saw the truth of that more and more for myself. The other is the fact that I just spent more time as a reader, not just as a student, but as a passionate reader of lyric poems of all kinds. And I realized that the essential faith that the lyric poem keeps is in the particular. And the faith that it allows itself is that if we look at the particular long enough, hard enough, deeply enough, without editorializing, without sentimentalizing, without moralizing, it will lead us to something that we might term the universal. But not by trying too hard, not by trying to underscore the point, but to believe that some commonplace flower like the daffodil can take us there, and to believe that a mangy street dog in Kala Ghoda can take us there, but to keep that faith. I think that to me is what the lyric poem is about. And whether it's Wordsworth or Arun Kolatkar or so many between and beyond, I think they remind us of that, all those practitioners of the lyric poem. And there's also a particular heritage of poetry that has meant a lot to me, which is the Bhakti poets of this subcontinent, the devotional poets, sacred poets of this subcontinent, for whom devotion was paramount, and who are poets who remind me again and again in this sort of utterly breathtaking fashion. They remind me that the local God can be a key to this universal God. This intimate God can be the portal to the infinite. And this faith, which allows them to speak of their God down the street as if you ought to know him. You know, when I was just talking about this Kannada woman poet a while ago to someone, Sule Sankabba. She's a sex worker poet who wrote in Kannada, and she speaks of Shiva as Nidlajeshwara, the God without shame. And she expects you to understand, and you do. So to be able to use that particular with this kind of keeping the faith that it will translate, it will be decoded. I think this has been very inspirational to me, and this is how I understand the Blake lines about holding infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. That's how it makes sense to me. And because you speak of this book, I must also say that I was asked by a very young, lovely British woman about my previous book, When God is a Traveler. She said to me, you know, I relate to the poems, but how do I understand Indian myths? I don't understand the references. I don't know what you're talking about. And now this was my version, another kind of version of the 546 Andheri local moment that I spoke of earlier. And it actually led me to write a poem, which is in this book, in which I say that really it's not about how do you approach Indian myth if you don't know it. You approach it the way I approach Greek myth, which is not trying too hard to get the foreign names and places and to get the pronunciation right. You can if you want, but that's not the point. It's keeping the faith that the more deeply you enter the subjective, it will lead you to the intersubjective. The more deeply you explore the self, it will lead you to touch that place that we might call the archetype. It's inevitable. I'm certain that all I really need to say about Abbayar, even when I read about her today, is that she's an old woman, she's a poet, she's a traveler. After that, I allow the archetype to do its work. There is absolutely no one who does not know that archetype. Somewhere, it leaks into your bloodstream. You recognize it even before you understand it. I think that's the faith I would keep, and that's how I would translate. Allow myself.
Actually, would you like to read that poem for us?
Maybe I could read. It's a long poem, so maybe a couple of short sections of that poem. Yeah. If I can find it, and if I remember. Okay.
It's the backbone poem. It's the central poem.
Yeah, it's central to the book, really. Okay. Abbayar lives in a face where the civil war is almost over. Frayed flags of peace hoisted, cavalry slumbering, garrison emptied. Nothing to declare anymore, she says, not even nostalgia. Perhaps just a few ruined keepsakes, a bottle of limoncello from a sun-slathered June in Amalfi, a butterscotch moon from a Tel Aviv hotel, a picture of a cat, pink-pawed, yogic. For lovers flatten into photographs, photographs into reminiscence, reminiscence into quiet. And then what's left? Perhaps just the oldest thing in the world, love, without a story. Aveyar knows that tyrannical algebra teachers die, and timid cleaning ladies with floral aprons too. She knows oligarchic poets blur into fussy grandpas, dashing bankers get dementia, and the prettiest girls in class slash their wrists in beach homes felled by boredom and barbiturates. She knows that the aging ustad is eventually ousted by triglycerides and court politics, and the silent acolyte with smoldering eyes and humid palms. She knows every court must have its oily pandit, its bleating groupies, its sullen cavillers, its jester stoned on his own demagoguery. She knows every sangha has its devadatta, plotting his coup in a blue swirl of power lust. She knows that everyone, everywhere, believes they've been wronged, that history was written by someone else, and that they're always right. It goes on, but I'm going to stop there. But I just hope that someone somewhere will pick up the Aveyar poems and read them, even if they don't read the book, because for me, in many ways, Aveyar has been pivotal to my understanding of love and the journey and the whole business of walking the world, really. And I'm not done with her yet. And it's that actually that makes me come back to what you were saying earlier, Akhil. I want to ask you actually about something you touched on, but which I asked you to defer, which is this question of form. Because what struck me about this particular manuscript, and I was struck by it in the first section as well, I want to focus on the first section at this point, and we can come to the others as well later. But what struck me really was how the sheer incoherence of grief is shaped, is organized, and yes, as you point out, metaphor plays a role, but it's also organized into these very quiet rhyming verses that never seem brittle and trite and clever and easy, all those seductive options that exist. So I want to ask you more about your approach to form in this particular book.
Actually, one of the poets that one has gone back to quite often and has also guided, mediated one's relationship to form is what in the 90s Agha Shahid Ali was doing with form. And this is The Country Without a Post Office, but also The Last Collection Rooms Are Never Finished. In those set of poems where, first of all, he's thinking about what is happening to his homeland, Kashmir, in the 90s. And then he's thinking about a subject matter which seemed to have become the most difficult subject matter for him later on, which is the death of his own mother. And it was remarkable. I was reading one of his interviews. He was doing it with a colleague, I think at UMass Amherst, when he was posted there. And he said that it's precisely when the subject matter became too difficult that form came to my rescue. As we know, today Kartika Nair, actually earlier on in the session today, she said, quoting a friend of hers, she said, I wrote Kunti's voice in the canzone precisely because every poet must write one canzone in their life. And Shahid has a glorious honor of having written 3 canzones, which are now part of the Veil Suite, which is a collected works. And in 2 of those canzones, one is Lennox Hill. He's deliberating on the death of his mother through a story of the elephants of Mihirgulla, 6th century Hun, who, having once heard the elephant fall down from the Pir Panjal range in Kashmir, loved that cry of the falling elephant so much he asked his soldiers to push elephant after elephant. And that story, those elephants sound like the sirens which are moving in Manhattan to his mother, who's recovering at the Lenox Hill Hospital after the surgery. And that struck me, that wait a minute, form which otherwise, to an untrained kind of postgraduate eye of mine earlier on, struck as something which is a kind of litany of rules. Actually, those litany of rules are the ones which are giving you sufficient restraint, which are giving you expansive vocabulary, which are also giving you a kind of a vertebrae to hold otherwise inchoate, ragged incoherence of grief, as you phrased it. And which is why, and I think, I mean, what's more wonderful than rhyme? I mean, it's the surety of return. It's an echo in otherwise like the Tower of Babel. It's something that it's the reassurance that at some point, no matter how far we stray, one will come back to the familiar. And that capacity of rhyme, finally, after having traveled through an Indian school system of poetry where poetry is almost synonymous with rhyming, where you read only rhymed verse, to a kind of undergraduate arrogance of trying free verse and thinking that's the most radical form possible and form is for conservative idiots, to finally arriving at an imagination of form where it's able to do a kind of affective and technical work, which even if it's using only, let's say, an ABAB quatrain, allows you. And maybe I can read one example of it. It's if I'm able to find it, it's a book that I deeply admire. It's Krishna Sokti's Dilo Danish, Delhi-based writer. And one of the lines that I was listening to a durational reading of Krishna Sokti's text by Professor Anuradha Kapoor, who is also a colleague at Ambedkar University. And one of the lines that struck me on one of the nights of a durational reading was, "Itna barik na sutiye ki hamari jaan par bana." And the rest of the poem, attempting even a kind of a bhakti horizontality between devotee and God, but the rest of the poem became just an attempt to translate this line, which seemed very difficult for me to translate, but also highly seductive in the way it calls out to you to be translated. And as you will notice, it also works with 3 ABAB quatrains. 12 variations on a Sokti line. Itna barik na sutiye ki hamari jaan par banaye. Do not thresh me so thin that I die. Do not cut me so sharp that I break. Do not braid me so fine that I sigh. Do not shear me so close that I ache. Do not press me so hard that I paper. Do not knit me so tight that I tear. Do not sear me so far that I vapor. Do not draw me so red that I scare. Do not crush me so muslin that I fly. Do not burn me so ash that I winter. Do not spin me so cunning that I cry. Do not shard me so hot that I splinter. And actually what was running in my mind when I wrote this, apart from it being a kind of an intertextual tribute to a Delhi writer who I deeply admire and whose work I return to often in my own reading and in the classroom, Krishna Sokti, was actually what was running in my mind, not oddly enough, was Bhakti poetry of Akka Devi and Lal Dev, where there is a conversation of claim to the Godhead, not that of supplication. And it's remarkable how that is another convergence that Love Without a Story and a biography of After share.
In fact, I'd love you to read, I was just thinking about, for me, a poem that I think of as a conceit poem, starting with the central image of rivers, and then it opens into it is your love poem as well. There is a poem called, I think, Rivers That Cross Cities. Would you read them?
Let me find, yeah. So, and this is, in fact, this is something that Arundhathi and I also chatted about briefly. In this poem, what could be a more interior and a more personal subject matter than love? And yet often vocabulary for love is gained through entering through the portal of the impersonal, that which is not you. And in fact, the strongest moments, the most moving moments even in Love Without a Story are moments where one begins to reflect on things and places and people which are not oneself. And here, the geography of rivers across both rivers I've seen and rivers I've seen only on a map gave me the vocabulary for thinking about all the slippages that can take place between two people, how rivers cross their cities. Near a church in Karada, the Tigris takes such a sharp turn as if it doesn't want to leave Baghdad. The Lyari in Karachi, on the other hand, can't be bothered to stay. Through Delhi, Yamuna is a moral lesson, clear as day. Life is tough, first a trough, then a crest, then a trough. The Chenab, knowing better, walks on stilts, keeps a one-arm distance from Jhang. The Ganga covers Patna like a quilt. The Gomti baby bumps through Lucknow. And when it's about to leave for a last look at Chennai, the Adyar turns as the Ravi cold presses the cheek of Lahore that burns. And often as it happens, in a poem, the image comes before the rest of the lines, and here it was, and I was looking at the map. I was visiting Chennai and I was looking at its map beforehand to decide on which places I'd go to. And I noticed that just before it meets the sea, the Adyar turns a little. And that small, evocative, hesitant turn was the moment where the river gained a personality. As in both our collections, the non-human world sort of emerges as a full-throated animated entity.
Akhil, poems change the way we map our worlds. So I'm not going to be able to look at the Adyar River in quite the same way after this.
Maybe I have one last question for you, Arundhathi, if you don't mind. And this is something that we've been thinking about earlier on in the week as well. And especially as a love poet, I noticed, for instance, across the different poems in the collection, whether they are poems the figure of the friends, whether they are poems implicating the Abhya, there is also a form of disenchantment with certain forms of the political. When they take a particular form, and especially, in the poem that she read, Deleting the Picture, there are those college students with their overconfident certainties and the edge in their voice when they speak of Gramsci and their stances without journeys. And there is a way in which there is a yearning, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, there is a yearning for a form of the political which will both recognize the uniqueness of the individual, recognize all kinds of interior journeys that an individual undertakes, and not be subsumed within a certain party line of sorts. There is a very evocative line in Arundhathi's one of other poems where she says, in a sense, the sparrow's nest means much more to her than a newspaper, to the poet persona. And I'm just wondering, and this is not a question specific to this book, what has been your relationship to this, to arrival at the stance with a journey? So, give us a sense, and maybe that we can close the discussion with that as well. And if you'd like to read something along with that.
I think that I'm not sure I would call it disenchantment, but I certainly think that I'm uncomfortable with I use the full stop and the period all the time, but I'm uncomfortable with dogmatic certainties. And this is not just it's in every sphere, whether it's the cultural, the religious, or what we might call the political, though of course all these categories intersect. And I think there is a very deep mistrust. And I think poetry as a form itself for me has often seemed like language that by definition is suspicious of borrowed wisdom and borrowed language. And I often think of it as a kind of passive or a movement of resistance, a satyagraha, against any kind of ready-made language, whether it's the language of scripture, the language of slogan, the language of any kind. It resists language that is not based on something lived in. It's that lived in nature of language, I think, is what I'm talking about when I speak of stances with journeys. And in this book, and perhaps in my earlier collection as well, Akhil, that is When God is a Traveler, I think I was very aware that but perhaps aware of it in retrospect. But I think the shift that happened from where I lived, the earlier collections, to these two, is the fact that I was more interested here in affirming the person and the journey that I want for myself, the person I want to be, the journey that I want for myself, affirming that rather than spending my time denouncing something else. So I wanted to speak of the way I navigate and the speakers whom I'm interested in navigate their lives. There's Abhayar who tells me that there isn't a single point to any life journey. There are multiple points. And she says the point of any is a shared fruit and laughter, and there's no sadly or happily ever after. I'm interested in that wisdom. I'm interested in the wisdom of the catabolic women who tell me that there are tricks to turn rage into celebration. And I'm interested in the wisdom of the traveler who wants to have conversations with people in Ajmer at the Dargah and in La Verna at the monastery of St. Francis and in the seat of Vajrayana Buddhism and the abode of Shiva, which is Mount Kailash. I'm interested in those conversations without having to make another parallel comment on religious bigotry. For me, I just want to open up the kinds of experiential ways in which convergences happen. So I think I just wanted, and this again empowered by amongst many others, the Bhakti poets, who always remind me that the experiential over the doctrinal. That's what counts, that's what stays, that's true. And I think I wanted to sing of that, and I think since I can never quite mention the Bhakti poets without mentioning this, I want to say this very briefly. I think the way in which they really inspired me, and this resonated with my own, I think the insights of my own existential journey as well. The way in which they speak to me deeply is because they remind me that you can disagree with love. That's how they disagree with their gods. They abuse their gods. They shower all kinds of cuss words at their gods, some of them, but they never stop loving them. And to me, the idea, one, that dissent does not mean disloyalty. And at the same time, the idea that contempt never makes for constructive change of any kind. Contempt is a kind of othering of whether in this case God or of any other group or person or individual. That's never going to be the way out either. So this essential inclusiveness of the Bhakti poets is something I've loved. And perhaps that's percolated into my work, but also because it resonated deeply with my own experience.
Actually that resolves several things that I've been thinking about in relation to the volume, and this unpacking of the experiential rather than immediately reducing it to the doctrinal, I think comes across very powerfully. And I'd urge, for those who are interested to get Arundhathi's volume, Love Without a Story, we have maybe 5 minutes, and if anyone has any thoughts or questions, or feel free to. I mean, the audience over here has soldiered throughout the day, so we will also recognize people are tired. But if anything springs to mind, then there is one question, I believe.
Thank you, Arundhathi and Akhil. That was a really enlightening discussion. Anyways, Akhil, you were talking about form and the importance of form in poetry. And this is my question to, I guess, the both of you. It's that with a language like English, or with any language whatsoever, the language comes with its own arsenal of, poetic devices and poetic tools the syllables, the weight of the syllables, for instance, is different in Hindi and in English. And then for a poet such as you both working in India, uh, in a different context, kind of translating the experience of living in this country into a language which is so different in many ways. Uh, what difficulties do you encounter in terms of reconciling influences you might have, such as Arundhathi has from the Tamil poet she was talking about, and the other poetic repositories of indigenous languages, kind of reconciling that with this with the English language, which has its own limitation in terms of form, as far as form is concerned. Because I mean, as a young poet who's starting out, you are always told that English has a limited number of rhymes, and you know the rhythm in English is naturally iambic; it falls to down, to down, to down. But that might be different for a poet writing in an indigenous language. So, how do you reconcile this sort of chasm between form and experience or content?
Akhil, why don't you take that
Would you like
first?
to take the?
No, I think you should. I've just answered yours, so I think it's good to hear you.
What's your name?
I'm Khalid. I'm Khalid.
So Khalid, actually, English, and I'm sure several will agree with me, English has had a fairly robust literary life in the subcontinent. I mean, you could trace it to various kinds of writings, but even if you trace it to literary, poetic writings, I mean, Henry Louis Vivian Derozio is what, early 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. And since then, actually, the debates on English's capacity to speak to the rhythms of subcontinental life forms, uh, 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 viewpoints, experiences has routinely happened, right? It happened with Rajrao and Kanthapura in kind of mid 20th century. It happens with when Akash Haidar is thinking about English, and when contemporary commentators on Shahid are saying when you read his poetry, it's as if he has written Urdu in English, and what he's trying to replicate is a form of lushness and an expansiveness of image and a kind of wild intertextuality with scriptures that he's able to do when he's writing Roots Are Never Finished, where the story of Karbala and Quranic references make seamless presence into an English. So, in a sense, the English has already been sort of broken and mended. English has already been churned and played with. And there's a fairly robust history of that having been done in the subcontinent. So one relies on that history and one becomes a kind of a late entrant into that wide history. And remember, some of the writers that we admire in English or in Hindi, two languages that I'm particularly familiar with, some of my favorite writers happen to be very comfortably bilingual. You know, so even as they are made icons of one particular linguistic heritage, they're actually thinking, expressing, contemplating, reflecting in the other language as well. And often there's a strange division of labor where they do certain kind of affective work in one language and a certain kind of critical work in another. So, so I think the English has been opened up, and this idea that English has limited number of rights, but often, I mean, if you look at, if I'm not mistaken, Akbar Allahabadi, if you look at some of his early 20th century poems on the Delhi Darbar, which had happened in 1911, when Delhi was made into the capital and moved from Kolkata to Calcutta to here, you read his what we would call a Hindi Urdu poem, and there is a massive, very wild sprinkling of interlinguistic puns. देख कर हैरान थे हरजन बॉल में नाचे लेडी कर्जन etc. It goes on like that. So English has never been held hostage to its own limitations in any case, if we were to consider it even a question of limitations. That would be my short answer to the otherwise a tricky question which lots of authors have obviously wrestled with. And if you read The Love Without a Story, Arundhathi's book, uh, words from other languages and concepts from other languages are not decorative presences in her English, they are constitutive presences in her English, and they change English itself. Arundhati, would you like to add something, and maybe we could close with that?
No, I think, no, I'd agree with you. I think you put it, it's wonderfully put. And I'd say to Khalid that, you know, whatever your language, Khalid, I suspect every poet wrestles with this, you know, that no language is adequate. Whatever your language, it's never adequate for to translate the experience that you want into language. This is a fundamental thing you wrestle with. Then when you're heir, as we are, to a multilingual culture, where even without entirely understanding another language, its cadences are sort of leaking into your own life. You know, the thing to think about is really how are these leaking in? What is it that you want to taste on your tongue? What will be true to this experience that you want to put on the page or to want to put into words? And it's a difficult journey. It's a journey when there will be lots of pauses, lots of, to go back to that earlier word, a lot of hoarseness, because it's never going to be enough. Whatever the language, it's never going to be enough. Whatever the resources, however well you know your language, it's never going to be enough. Once you reconcile yourself to that, and I'm not going into the whole question of, you know, what is an Indian poet and what are his or her resources when you're an Anglophone poet. I don't even want to get into that because I think so much has been said and Akhil's already talked about it. But I think this whole question, even more fundamentally, of whether language will ever be adequate, that's something that can trip you up even more at some point in your life. It could happen at any time. For me, it happened when I believed for a long time that my challenge was really how to translate cultural experiences into language. What is the feel of my mother's sari and how can I translate that into language? What is the feel of the puja room my grandmother used to spend a fair amount of her time in, and how do I translate that smell into English? Those were my questions until I was tripped up by a particular kind of silence in my life that made even those questions seem superficial. So it's on that level that I'd like to respond to your question for now, and I hope we can have a longer conversation later.
Hello, my name is Ryan, and I just finished reading Jezuri by Arundhathi Subramaniam, in which he takes a pilgrimage to the side of Khandova. And I felt such a kind of irony and skepticism, but also an immense kind of openness with the spiritual. So if you can briefly explain what has your relationship been with the spiritual throughout maybe in your 20s, like we believe we're skeptics, we're atheists, and things like that, and slowly maybe a transformation of experience happens. So how was your journey dealing with this feeling?
Ryan, I love Jejuri. It's a book I keep going back to. And I remember the first time I read it in my college library and fell in love with it. Simply because of what you said, this irreverence and irony on the one hand, and this ability to accommodate this darshan experience, which is what I think that old woman, the old beggar woman, offers the speaker when he looks into her eyes. So I think my own journey was not one from skepticism to belief, but certainly one of quest and a belief that my answers would come from certain sources. I believe my answers would come largely from the arts, and they did for a long time, from dance, from movement disciplines of various kinds, and through literature and music and theater. But there was a time in my life when, to go back to what I said earlier, a time of such intense silence that befell me. I say befell me because it felt like an ambush. And I was terrified and I didn't know how to make sense of it. And as I started crawling, really clambering out of that silence, I became, I think, in my own self-definition, less of a poet and more of a seeker, and willing to look for guidance from whatever quarter it came from. It didn't matter. That's how desperately I needed it. So I was willing to look a bit of a fool in the process, but I needed guidance desperately. And today I'd say that I've been guided less by verbal wisdom. Words are my trade, they're my discipline, they're what I hang around in, that's the workshop I live in. But my daily practice is non-verbal, and for want of a better word, I'd call it a spiritual practice. And it's that spiritual practice that allows me to see that it's from great silences that all these words emerge. That may seem like a platitude, but it's not a platitude in terms of my experience. I think there's been a change in the way I look at language and the way in which I approach poetry. I think I approach language, I may be writing about the same things, but I'm writing about them. The how has changed. At least in my experience, it has changed. I approach silences as well with much greater respect than before. And because I feel I am different as a result, I think the poems are different. Because I breathe differently, I think the poems are different. You know, the pauses are different. The awareness of how energized a pause can be, that has increased. My awareness and my respect for that has increased. So I think it's a wonderful question, and I wish I had more time to answer it. I'd say that I've learned from many sources along the way. The yogic traditions, for sure, that encourage you to bend but not break. The reclamation of spine, learning about spine, that it is possible to be respectful and to listen, but without ever losing spine. I use metaphors of spine because they've been very central to my poetry as well. So I loved what Akhil was talking about earlier, even in terms of the vertebrae that fixed forms can sometimes allow you. And I wish we could have a longer conversation about this, but I'm very mindful that we might be overstepping our time limit.
Thank you so much, Arundhathi, and thanks everyone for listening in. I hope we converge again soon in one situation or another and carry on the conversation. It's been such a joy reading your book again and engaging with you, and I hope we get to do it soon.
I look forward to deepening conversations, Akhil, and thank you all those of you who stayed on for this session. I know how exhausted you must be. Thank you.